Colonel Kim Sora sat in the cold metal chair, her wrists bound by energy shackles that hummed and sparked with alien technology. The blue light from the restraints cast eerie shadows on the walls of the holding cell. New Seoul. Station's detention center was a nightmare of rust and despair. The air tasted like recycled fear and broken dreams. 3 months of living in the station's low levels had destroyed her. What used to be a proud military officer now looked like any other homeless drifter. Her jacket was torn in 5 places, held together with wire and hope. Her pants were stained with engine oil from sleeping near the maintenance tunnels. Her once perfect hair hung in dirty tangles round her face. The smell was the worst part, unwashed bodies. Alien food scraps and the sharp chemical scent of the station's air recyclers. It clung to everything down here in the forgotten levels where humans came to disappear. Another vagrant causing trouble, muttered Guard Captain Vextar, his blue scales rippling with disgust. The Eltarian stood 7 feet tall, his reptilian head crowned with bony ridges. His forearms moved with practiced efficiency as he updated his security pad. These humans never learned their place in the new galaxy. Sora's dark eyes flashed with barely contained fury. Her jaw clenched as she remembered the trouble from 2 nights ago. She'd been scavenging for food scraps behind the market when she heard children crying. 2 human kids, maybe 8 and 10 years old, were being dragged toward a cargo bay by vegan slavers. The vegans were the worst kind of aliens, humanoid but wrong, with grey skin and black eyes that held no mercy. They traded in flesh across the galaxy, and human children brought premium prices in the outer sectors. Sora hadn't hesitated. The broken pipe from a water main had felt natural in her hands. Military training never really leaves you, even when everything else falls apart. The first vegan went down with a crushed throat. The second lost 3 teeth and his consciousness. The third got a knee to the solar plexus that folded him like origami. The fourth one actually drew his plasma pistol. But Sora was already moving. She disarmed him with a move that would have made her old drill sergeant proud. The security footage would show her single-handedly dismantling forearmed aliens in under 30 seconds. But it would also show her giving the children her last protein bar and walking them safely back to their parents. That's when station security arrived. They saw a dirty human woman standing over for injured aliens and made their assumptions. The children's parents were too scared to speak up. Their work visas could be revoked for any reason. Sora was arrested on the spot. Public Defender Lee Minho shuffled through his papers without looking up. His office was a closet with a desk, squeezed between a maintenance room and a storage unit. The fluorescent light flickered constantly, giving everything a sickly yellow tint. Minho was overworked, underpaid, and frankly tired of defending the hopeless cases that filtered down to him. Colonel Kim, he said in a bored voice, "It says here you were dishonorably discharged from military service. That's not going to help. You're a case honorably." Sora reacted, her voice hoarse from weeks of not talking to anyone. "Medical discharge. There's a difference." Minho barely glanced at her. He saw what everyone else saw. Another broken veteran who couldn't adjust to civilian life. Another casualty of the human-alien integration policies that left Earth's military obsolete. He had no idea he was looking at the woman who had saved humanity's outer colonies from complete annihilation. The lawyer flipped through more pages, his stylus making notes. "Says here you've been living in the lower levels for 3 months. No fixed address, no employment, no family contacts. The prosecution is painting you as a dangerous vagrant with violent tendencies." Sora almost laughed. Dangerous. If they only knew, she'd commanded space battles against impossible odds. She'd held the line when the alien armadas came calling. She'd watched her soldiers die, while she made the terrible decisions that kept humanity alive. The security footage is pretty clear. Minho continued, "You assaulted for alien citizens with an improvised weapon. That's a serious crime under the Interstellar Peace Accords. You could be looking at 10 years in an off-world prison." "They were slavers," Sora said quietly. "That's what you claim. But these Forelians are respected merchants with proper documentation. They say you attacked them unprovoked while they were conducting legitimate business." Sora closed her eyes. The system was rigged. Aliens had rights. Humans had obligations. That was the new reality since the integration wars ended with humanity's defeat. Earth was now just another colony world in a galaxy full of species that looked down on them. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent her career fighting to protect human space. Now she couldn't even protect the human children without ending. Up in chains. Minho gathered his papers and stood up. "I'll try to negotiate a plea deal. Maybe we can get you treatment instead of prison time. You're clearly suffering from post-traumatic stress." As he left, Sora stared at the energy shackles round her wrists. The humming sound reminded her of the plasma cannons on her old ship. She wondered if anyone would remember her real name. When this was all over, the preliminary hearing began in Courtroom 7, a sterile box with grey walls and flickering lights. Judge Han Boyan sat behind her desk, reviewing the case files with practiced efficiency. The room smelled like old coffee and recycled air. A handful of spectators filled the gallery, mostly other defendants waiting their turn and a few court watchers with nothing better to do. Sora's military records were sealed, classified at the highest levels that even the judge couldn't access. Only fragments emerged like pieces of a broken puzzle. Service in the Outer Rim territories, multiple commendations for Vela, medical discharge following something called catastrophic unit loss. The details were blacked out, hidden behind layers of military secrecy. What the records didn't show was the real story, the siege of Titan Base. The name alone made veteran soldiers wake up in cold sweats. For 8 months, Colonel Kim Sora had commanded the 127th Tactical Response Unit against impossible odds when the Draxan Empire launched their surprise attack on the outer colonies. Her unit was all that stood between total extinction and 3 million human civilians. In the gallery, retired Sergeant Park Ji-woo leaned forward in his seat. His weathered face was covered in scars from plasma burns. He'd lost his left eye in the siege, but he still remembered every detail like it happened yesterday. "The enemy had us outnumbered 50-1. He whispered to his companion, another veteran named Cho Sang-min. 50,000 Draxan warriors against our 1,000 soldiers. But the colonel, she turned that moon into a fortress. Every crater, every tunnel, every piece of debris became a weapon. The Draxan Empire was humanity's worst nightmare made real. They stood 8 feet tall, with forearms and skin like living metal. Their ships were organic, grown rather than built, and they could repair themselves in battle. When they invaded human space, they didn't just conquer planets, they consumed them. Every human they captured was either enslaved or used as food. Titan Base was supposed to be a routine mining operation. The moon orbited a gas giant in the Kepler system, rich in rare minerals that Earth needed for its growing fleet. 3 million colonists lived in the underground cities, raising families and building new lives far from Earth's overcrowded surface. Then the Draxan came out of hyperspace like a plague of locusts. 200 warships, each one the size of a city. They swept aside the orbital defenses in minutes. The evacuation alarms started screaming. But there wasn't enough time. The transport ships could only carry so many people. That's when Colonel Sora made the decision that would haunt her forever. She ordered her unit to stay behind and buy time for the evacuation. 1,000 soldiers against an alien army. It should have been suicide. But Sora was different. She understood that conventional warfare was useless against the Draxen. Instead, she turned the moon itself into a weapon. The mining tunnels became a maze of death traps. The processing plants became bomb factories. Every piece of heavy equipment was rigged to explode. She gave us each a sector to defend. Park Ji-woo continued, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, told us to make every shot count. The Draxen came at us in waves. Like angry insects, their ships would land and spill out hundreds of warriors. We'd hit them with everything we had, then fall back to the next position. The battle was brutal beyond imagination. Draxen warriors were nearly indestructible. Their metal skin could deflect most weapons, but Sora had studied their physiology. She knew their weak points, the joints between their armor plates, the soft spots round their eyes. She taught her soldiers to aim for those spots. The first month was the worst. The Draxen thought they could overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers. They lost 10,000 warriors learning they were wrong. Sora's soldiers fought like demons, using every trick in the book. They collapsed. Tunnels on advancing enemies. They used the low gravity to their advantage, bouncing grenades off walls and ceilings. They turned mining lasers into weapons of war. But numbers always tell in the end. Sora watched her soldiers die one by one as they bought precious time for the evacuation ships. Lieutenant Kim Tae-ho died holding Tunnel 7 against 100 Draxen warriors. Sergeant Lee Yuno sacrificed herself to destroy a Draxen command post. Captain Park Min-jun died with a plasma rifle in his hands, defending the main communications ray. Each death was a knife in Sora's heart. These weren't just soldiers. They were her friends. She'd trained with them, fought with them, shared meals and stories with them. Now she was sending them to die, while she coordinated the defense from the command bunker. The evacuation took 6 months, 6 months of constant fighting, of watching her unit shrink from 1,000 to 500 to 200 to 50. The Draxen kept coming, wave after wave of metal-skinned killers. But somehow, impossibly, the defense held. When the reinforcements finally arrived, the combined fleets of Earth and her allies, they found something that would become legend. Colonel Kim Sora, alone in the command bunker, surrounded by the bodies of her fallen comrades. She had a shattered arm from a Draxen claw weapon, 3 bullet wounds in her chest. But she was still coordinating the defense, still fighting, still refusing to surrender. The victory saved the colonies, but it destroyed her mind. The nightmares came first, then the guilt. Why had she survived when so many good soldiers died? The faces of the dead followed her everywhere. In quiet moments, she could hear their voices calling her name. The military doctors did their best. Therapy, medication, counseling. But some wounds never heal. Some scars go to deep. Sora was quietly discharged with full honors and a pension. That she was too proud to claim. She'd saved 3 million lives. But she couldn't save herself from the darkness that followed. Bailiff Choi Dae-jin had served 30 years in the colonial navy before retiring to his quiet job. At the courthouse, his fingers were stained with ink from processing legal documents, and his uniform was simple gray instead of the proud blue he used to wear. Most days were routine. Call the docket. Maintain order. Help the judge with paperwork. Nothing exciting ever happened in Courtroom 7. But today was different. As he called the morning docket, reading names from his tablet in the same monotone voice he'd used for 5 years. One name made him freeze mid-sentence. The tablet slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. He looked up sharply at the disheveled woman in the defendant's chair, his eyes wide with recognition. "Did you say Kim Sora?" he asked the clerk, his voice barely above a whisper. Court clerk Nem Hyjin glanced at her screen without looking up. "That's correct. Vagrant. disturbing the peace. Assault on alien security personnel. Standard stuff. Daejin's hands trembled. As he reached for his personal communicator, his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The Iron Lady of Titan Base, here in chains. Looking like she'd been living in the station's waste disposal units, he stepped into the hallway and made the first call. Park Ju, it's Daejin. You need to get down to Courtroom 7, now. And bring everyone you can find. Within minutes, the message was spreading through the station's veteran network like wildfire. Text messages, voice calls. Even the old military communication channels that technically didn't exist anymore. The Iron Lady of Titan Base was alive, and she was in chains. The word traveled from the maintenance decks where ex-soldiers worked as janitors to the upper levels where former officers managed shipping companies. It reached the bars where veterans gathered to share stories, and the support groups where they tried to heal from wars that never really ended. Meanwhile, Prosecutor Kang Yujin was having the worst morning of his career. What should have been a simple assault case was falling apart in his hands. He'd been assigned to prosecute the vagrant woman, expecting to wrap it up in an hour and move on to more important cases instead. He was discovering troubling inconsistencies that made his stomach churn. The security personnel Sora had assaulted were actually members of a known trafficking ring. Kang had run their names through the database and found connections to slave markets in the Outer Rim. One of them, a vegan named Drexel, had been suspected of kidnapping human children for 3 years, but every time authorities got close, he disappeared into the maze of interstellar commerce laws. The children she had kidnapped were victims she had rescued. Kang had tracked down their parents, a human couple named Lee who worked the night shift at the water recycling plant. They were terrified to talk, afraid their work visas would be revoked. But their 8-year-old daughter had drawn pictures of the nice lady who saved them from the scary grey man. The more Kang dug, the more he realized this wasn't a simple assault case. It was a cover-up. Someone with serious connections had made sure the trafficking ring's version of events became the official story. The real question was why his investigation led him to the surveillance footage from that night. The official version showed only the aftermath, Sora standing over for injured aliens. But Kang was good at his job. He found the deleted files, the camera angles that had been mysteriously corrupted, the witness statements that had been buried. The truth was devastating. The footage showed foreign vegan slavers dragging to human children toward a cargo ship. It showed Sora intervening with military precision, disabling the aliens without killing them. It showed her giving the children her last food and walking them safely home. Then it showed station security arriving and making the wrong assumptions. The courtroom began to fill with an unusual crowd. Veterans from every branch of service started, arriving in small groups. Some wore their old uniforms, the fabric faded but still pressed to perfection. Others came in civilian clothes, but their bearing gave them away. The way they walked, the way they scanned the room for threats, the way they positioned themselves near exits. Former Colonial Navy Captain Song Min-kyung arrived wearing her dress, uniform, medals gleaming on her chest. She'd lost her left arm in the Battle of Proxima Station, but she stood straighter than most people with 2 arms. Retired Marine Sergeant Kim Dong-wook limped in on a prosthetic leg, his cane tapping against the floor. He'd served under Sora during the Kepler campaign, before Titan Base became a legend. They came quietly, respectfully, but with a purpose that made the air itself seem to vibrate with tension. The alien observers in the galley shifted uncomfortably. They'd never seen humans behave this way before. Even the court staff noticed something was wrong. The usual chatter died down to whispers. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Bailiff Choi Daejin stood straighter, his Old military bearing returning for the first time in years. Word reached the upper levels of the station. Station Commander Yin Jae-sung, a former colonial marine himself, quietly made his way to the courtroom. He didn't announce himself, just slipped into the back row and waited. The Altarian guards outside the courtroom were nervous. They could sense something building. Like the moment before a storm breaks, their blue scales rippled with anxiety as more and more humans gathered in the corridor. "What's happening?" asked Guard Captain Vextar, his forearms twitching toward his weapons. "I don't know," replied his lieutenant. "But these humans, they're different. They're not like the usual courthouse crowd." Inside the courtroom, prosecutor Kang Yoo-jin was making a decision that would change his career forever. He looked at the evidence spread across his desk, the real evidence, not the sanitized version he'd been given. Then he looked at the woman in the defendant's chair. Colonel Kim So-ra sat with her head down, unaware that a legend was gathering round her like a protective shield. She didn't see the veterans filling the gallery. She didn't know that her name was spreading through the station's communication networks. She was lost in her own darkness, fighting battles that only she could see. But the recognition protocol had begun. After 3 years of being invisible, of being forgotten, of being just another homeless veteran, So-ra was about to discover that heroes are never really forgotten. They just wait for the right moment to be remembered. Judge Admiral Han Bo-young entered the courtroom with military precision. Her polished boots clicked against the metal floor in perfect rhythm. At 65, she still carried herself like the warrior she'd been for 40 years in the Colonial Defense Force. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her judicial robes couldn't hide the ramrod-straight posture of a career soldier. She'd seen combat in the Vegan War, commanded a destroyer during the Proxima Rebellion, and earned more medals than she could count. But even she hadn't expected what happened. Next, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Veterans filled every seat, lined the walls, and spilled into the hallway. The air hummed with quiet tension, like the moment before a battle begins. Han noticed the mix of uniforms, some current military, others wearing their old service dress with pride. Many were in civilian clothes, but their bearing gave them away instantly. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Han Bo-young," called Bailiff Choi Dae-jin. His voice stronger than it had been in years. The room stood as one. But there was something different about it. This wasn't the usual lazy shuffle of courthouse regulars. This was military sharp, precise, unified. Han felt a chill run down her spine. She took her seat and opened the docket, scanning the morning's cases. Petty theft, public intoxication, the usual station business. Then she reached the assault case that had somehow drawn this crowd. "The court calls the case of New Seoul Station versus Kim So-ra," she announced, reading from the docket. Her voice was steady, professional, but something about the name tugged at her memory. "Colonel Kim So-ra, 127th Tactical Response Unit, hero of Titan Base, recipient of the Solar Cross with Valor." The words died in her throat. The docket slipped from her fingers for a moment. The only sound in the courtroom was the hum of the air recyclers. The transformation was instantaneous. Every person in the courtroom who had ever worn a uniform snapped to attention. The bailiff straightened like a steel rod. The court reporter, a former Navy communications officer, shot to her feet. 3/4 of the gallery rose as one, their heels clicking together in perfect synchronization. Even prosecutor Kang Yoo-jin, who had served briefly in the reserves during law school, found himself standing at attention. His hand moved instinctively to his chest, muscle memory from a salute he hadn't given in 15 years. Judge Han herself stood, her hand moving instinctively to her chest in salute. The gesture was automatic, burned into her DNA by decades of military service. "The Titan's Iron Lady," she whispered, her voice carrying in the suddenly silent courtroom. The alien observers were stunned. Ambassador Zekethel of the Altarian Consortium had attended hundreds of human legal proceedings, but he'd never seen anything like this. His blue scales rippled with confusion as he watched an entire room of humans transform before his eyes. What is happening? He whispered to his aide, a nervous young Altarian named Velta. I don't know. Excellence. They're all looking at the defendant. The vegan trade representative, Drexmel, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His grey skin had taken on a sickly pallor. He'd been expecting a quick conviction. Maybe a few years in prison for the vagrant who had interfered with his associate's business. Instead, he was watching humans display unified reverence for someone they'd written off as worthless. In the defendant's chair, Colonel Kim Sora sat motionless. She hadn't looked up when her name was called. She hadn't seen the crowd gathering round her, but now, as the weight of their attention settled on her shoulders, she slowly raised her head. Tears streamed down her face. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't alone with her demons. These people remembered. They understood. The silence stretched for long moments. Then, from somewhere in the gallery, a voice called out, "Semperfi, Colonel." It was Marine Sergeant Kim Dong-wook, the man who'd served under her during the Kepler campaign. His voice cracked with emotion, but it carried clearly through the courtroom. Horror! Came the response from a dozen throats. Then more voices joined in, a growing chorus of support. Iron Lady, hero of Titan Base, remember the 127th. Judd Hon had to bang her gavel to restore order, but her own eyes were wet with tears. She'd read the classified reports about Titan Base. She knew what this woman had done, what she'd sacrificed, to see her reduced to this, homeless, forgotten. Charged with protecting children from slavers, it was a disgrace that shamed them. All counselors approached the bench. Judge Han ordered. Prosecutor Kang Yujin and Public Defender Lee Min-ho walked forward on shaky legs. The weight of what they were witnessing had hit both men like a physical blow. "Mr. Kang, Judge," Han said quietly, "I assume you've done your homework on this case." "Yes, Your Honor. I have discovered irregularities in the initial investigation. The alleged victims appear to be connected to known trafficking organizations. The defendant was actually rescuing children from—" "I don't want to hear it in chambers," Judge Han interrupted. "I want it on the record, all of it." She turned to the gallery, her voice carrying the authority of 40 years in uniform. "This court will take a 30-minute recess while counsel prepares their statements. But let me be clear, justice will be served here today. Real justice." The alien observers were whispering among themselves, trying to understand what they were witnessing. They'd never seen humans rally round one of their own like this. The vagrant in the defendant's chair had somehow transformed into something else entirely. A symbol, a legend, a reminder of what humanity could achieve when pushed to its limits. As the courtroom slowly emptied for a recess, veterans approached the defendant's table one by one. They didn't speak. Words weren't necessary. They just stood for a moment, acknowledging the woman who had saved their civilization, then quietly moved on. Station Commander Yin Jae-sung was the last to approach. He'd been a lieutenant during the Titan Base siege, one of the reinforcement officers who'd found Sora alone in that command bunker. He knelt beside her chair and spoke quietly. "Colonel, permission to speak freely." Sora looked up, her eyes focusing on him with difficulty. "Granted, Commander. It's good to see you again." "Ma'am, we've been looking for you." "I'm not that person anymore," Sora whispered. "With respect, Colonel, you're exactly that person. You always have been. We just forgot to remind you." As the recess continued, Word spread beyond the courthouse. The story was already hitting the station's news networks. Hero of Titan Base found alive. Iron Lady faces trial. The woman who saved 3 million lives charged with assault. The galaxy was about to remember why humans were considered the most dangerous species in known space, not because they were the strongest or the smartest, but because they never abandoned their own. The recognition protocol was complete. Now came the reckoning. When court resumed, the atmosphere had completely changed. The gallery was now packed with over 200 veterans, their presence turning the small courtroom into something that felt more like a military ceremony than a legal proceeding. News crews had arrived, their cameras capturing every moment. As the story spread across the galaxy's communication networks, Judge Han Boyoung took her seat with renewed purpose. She'd spent the recess reviewing classified military files that required her personal security clearance to access. What she'd read had shaken her to her core. The woman sitting in the defendant's chair wasn't just a hero. She was a legend who had been forgotten by the very system she died to protect. The court will now hear the prosecutor's amended statement. Judge Han announced. Prosecutor Kang Yujin stood up, his hands trembling slightly as he held his notes. Your Honor, after thorough investigation, I move to dismiss all charges against Colonel Kim So-ra with prejudice. Furthermore, I request this court authorize a full investigation into the trafficking ring that has been operating on this station under the protection of Crab Toffee. Shields, the charges were not just dropped. They were expunged from the record with prejudice. But Judge Han wasn't finished. She stood up, her voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in uniform. This court owes Colonel Kim an apology, she declared, her words echoing through the packed courtroom. We failed her. The system failed her. But that ends today. She ordered a full investigation into the trafficking ring, and within hours, the results were devastating. Station security, guided by Kang's evidence, raided 12 different locations. They found documentation of slave sales, shipping manifests for human cargo, and bank records showing payments to corrupt officials. The operation had been running for 3 years, hidden in plain sight. The arrest sweep was swift and brutal. 12 alien criminals were taken into custody, including the 4 vegans who had framed So-ra. More importantly, they rescued 37 human children who had been held in shipping containers, waiting to be sold to buyers in the Outer Rim. The alien press coverage was explosive. Within hours, footage of the courtroom scene was playing on news networks across the galaxy. The image of an entire room of humans standing in respect for their wounded warrior sent shockwaves through alien society. They'd never seen anything like it. The Altarian ambassador, Zekethel, held an emergency press conference. His blue scales rippled with what humans learned was embarrassment as he publicly apologized for his people's role in the trafficking operation. We have failed to understand the sacred bond between human warriors and their society. He admitted, this will not happen again. The Vegan High Council, faced with evidence of their citizens' crimes, issued new directives about respecting human veterans. They also paid massive reparations to the rescued children's families and established a fund for veteran support services. But the real transformation was happening closer to home. Within hours of the trial's end, So-ra was in a private medical facility aboard the station's upper levels. The veteran community had rallied round her, creating a support network that extended far beyond just one forgotten hero, Dr. Kim Jae-hyun, a former military medic who now ran the station's veteran clinic, personally oversaw her treatment. You should have been getting this care 3 years ago, he told her as medical scanners mapped the damage to her body and mind. But we're going to fix what we can. The healing process was slow but steady, physical therapy for her old injuries, counseling for the trauma that had been eating at her soul. But most importantly, she was surrounded by people who understood what she'd been through. Former Marine Captain Song Min-kyung visited every day, sharing stories of her own struggles with post-war adjustment. Sergeant Park Ji-woo brought other Titan-based survivors to see her, men and women who'd been carrying their own guilt about surviving when so many had died. "You saved us all," Park told her during one visit. "But you forgot to save yourself. That's what we're here for now." The support network grew beyond the medical facility. Veterans across the station organized fundraisers, job placement programs, and housing assistance for homeless former soldiers. Sora's case had exposed a systemic failure that affected thousands of people. 6 months later, Colonel Kim So-ra stood before the Joint Colonial Council, her uniform crisp and her bearing proud once again. The same woman who had been living in the station's low levels was now addressing representatives from across human space. She had been appointed Special Advisor for Veteran Affairs, tasked with ensuring no soldier would ever fall through the cracks again. The council chamber was a massive dome that could hold 10,000 people. Representatives from dozens of worlds sat in curved rows, their faces reflecting the diversity of human civilization. Alien observers watched from special galleries, still trying to understand what they'd witnessed. "We are not defined by our worst moments," So-ra told the assembled delegates, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. "We are defined by how we lift each other up when we fall. That is what makes us human. That is what makes us strong." She talked about the soldiers who'd been forgotten, the heroes who'd become homeless, the system that had failed the very people who died to protect it. But she also talked about hope, about the power of community, about the unbreakable bonds that tied human warriors together across time and space. The standing ovation lasted for 10 minutes. Delegates from every human world rose to their feet, applauding not just for So-ra, but for every veteran who'd ever struggled to find their place in peacetime. Even the alien observer stood, finally understanding something fundamental about human nature. In the gallery, Sergeant Park Ji-woo wiped tears from his eyes. The colonel was back, and she was still fighting, not with weapons this time, but with words and compassion and the unbreakable bonds of human loyalty. The speech led to sweeping reforms. The Veteran Protection Act passed unanimously, establishing support centers on every human world. The Heroes Housing Initiative ended veteran homelessness within 2 years. The Warriors Bond program connected former soldiers with support networks that would last a lifetime. But perhaps most importantly, it reminded humanity of something they'd forgotten in their rush to integrate with galactic society. They were not just another species in the cosmic community. They were the people who'd held the line when darkness came calling. They were the ones who'd sacrificed everything to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The Titan's Iron Lady had found her way home, and in doing so, she'd shown the galaxy what it truly meant to be human. The end.